It did not turn. It did not even hesitate. It sat politely immovable, as if it had decided some time ago that Mrs. Giddings was not, under any circumstances, to be admitted. That in itself was curious but not alarming. What troubled Mrs. Giddings was that the curtains, which were usually parted with a careful modesty, remained drawn. She knocked again, a little louder. "Lavinia," she called, allowing just a suggestion of neighbourly familiarity. It was a word she had never spoken aloud before, and felt faintly reckless using now. Still nothing. Mrs. Giddings stood back, adjusted the cardigan that served as both garment and confidence, and took in the small details. The milk bottle sat untouched on the step. A faint thread of condensation had started to form inside the glass. The post had been pushed through the letterbox and lay just inside, visible through the thin slit. Miss Harker did not leave her post lying on the floor. That was the point at which concern, like a careful guest, removed its hat and stepped fully into the hall. Mrs. Giddings did the only sensible thing available to a woman of her instincts and position. She went to tell someone else. By 10:30, 3 people had attempted the handle. Mr. Dallin, who ran the ironmonger's, tried with a firmness that suggested he considered stubborn doors to be a personal challenge. It did not turn for him either. Mrs. Pike, who had once worked as a cleaner at the town hall and retained a lingering belief in access through persistence, tried knocking in a variety of tones, brisk, sympathetic, and deeply offended. There was no response, and then the handle was tried by Sergeant Reville. He had not been summoned in any formal sense. He had simply passed the knot of people and slowed down in the manner of a man who disliked mysteries but hated ignited gossip more. "There's no need for fuss," he said. "She's probably gone to visit a relation." "Miss Harker has no relations," Mrs. Giddings said, with the calm triumph of somebody rectifying a public record. Reville knocked, officially this time. The sort of knock that carried the faint suggestion of authority. Silence answered. He tried the handle. It remained stubbornly, rudely, defiantly locked. By noon the word "missing" had not yet been spoken, but it had begun to form itself in the spaces between sentences. By 1 o'clock tea was being made and half drunk, while faces leaned together in small, gossiping triangles. And at 2:02, Inspector Pirbright was told. He arrived without urgency, which was one of his more unsettling habits. He walked down Pennywell Row as though he had all the time in England, his hat still, his coat unhurried, his expression one of mild professional interest rather than excitement. Mrs. Giddings watched him approach and felt, irrationally, as if she were being inspected herself. "Good afternoon," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "There's no answer," Mrs. Giddings said at once, as though he might otherwise imagine she had simply brought him for tea. "I understand," Pirbright replied, in a voice that implied he understood a great many things without announcing any of them. He looked at the door. It was an ordinary door, sound, clean, slightly glossed. He looked at the milk bottle, the post, the lace curtains. He listened rather than knocked. This, too, was unsettling to those watching. At last he tried the handle. It did not move. "That is unfortunate," he said gently, to nobody in particular. "Shouldn't you break it down?" Mr. Dallin suggested, in a tone of romantic hopefulness. Pirbright smiled faintly. "I find that doors, once broken, have a regrettable tendency to remain so." He leaned a little closer, peering through the letterbox slit. From inside the house came no sound at all, no wireless, no footsteps, no stirring of ordinary life. Just the faint, disciplined silence of a room that had been abandoned without ceremony. And faintly, far back in the hallway, the impression of something that had been left unfinished. By 2:30, Flaxborough had decided that silence was no longer acceptable. The locked door remained a fact, but facts in Flaxborough were never left alone for long. They were turned over, warmed, softened, and eventually improved through communal handling. Mrs. Giddings had already set out her best cups by the time the first tremor reached the high street. She did not serve tea because she thought it necessary. She served tea because it helped words to move more freely. "It's not natural," Mrs. Pike said, holding her cup as though it were a moral instrument. "A door staying locked in daylight?" Mr. Dallon, who had brought a faint dusting of iron filings with him from his shop, leaned forward. "Could be she's fainted, hit her head, slid quietly to the floor." "No marks on the step," Mrs. Giddings replied. "No scuffing. Miss Harker was very careful with her footwear." This was accepted as significant. By 3:00, the town had produced 3 theories, none of which involved Miss Harker having done anything so extravagant as leaving of her own accord. The first was that she had been taken unwell and was lying on the floor, still alive, but socially compromised by the length of her undignified posture. The second was that she had gone visiting, which was immediately contradicted by everyone who had ever known her. The third was not spoken aloud, but hovered like a well-bred ghost among the cups. Inspector Pirbright remained on Pennywell Row, where the afternoon light had grown tired and yellow, and the lace curtains had begun to look faintly reproachful. He had not forced the door. He had not raised his voice. He had not asked for reinforcements. He had simply waited. Waiting, he had found, was often more educational than action. He listened to the street. The sounds were small and telling: a child's half-hearted whistle, the rattle of a milk crate being removed by someone who knew it was too late to be useful, the careful conversation of checking steps that were not supposed to be checking. Sergeant Revel joined him again at 3:15, carrying with him the faint smell of official rubber soles and mild offence. "You can't stand here all day, sir," Revel said, not unkindly. "I am not standing here for the door," Pirbright replied. "I am standing here for the town." He lifted the letterbox gently, like a man disturbing a sleeping eyelid, and looked inside again. The hallway was orderly. Too orderly. A faint line of daylight stretched across the floorboards, stopping at the foot of a small table. On that table, just within sight, sat a tray. 2 teacups, one empty, one half full. The tea in the second cup had long since surrendered its warmth, but it had not been disturbed. No floating leaves, no trembling ring on the saucer. Someone had poured it and left it standing. Someone else had not yet drunk it. 2 cups, Revel said quietly, peering beside him. "Yes," Pirbright said, "and only 1 chair drawn out." Sergeant Revel frowned, but carefully, as if frowning too much might commit him to a theory. Up the street, conversation was beginning to thicken. "You heard about Harker?" someone said, aiming for restrained alarm, but achieving satisfaction. "Door locked," came the answer. "Milk untouched. 2 cups, they say." They always do. By 4:00, Flaxborough had begun to feel a small, private trembling. It hid it well. It polished it, straightened it, and set it behind lace curtains. But it was there, because locked doors were one thing, but a cup of tea poured for someone who never drank it was another. Pirbright stepped back from the slit, letting the letterbox close with a soft, decent click. "That will do for now," he said, more to the house than to the sergeant. Outside, the town shifted its weight and drew its breath. Inside, the 2 cups sat untouched, one empty, one waiting, as if time itself had been asked to stand still, and had politely obliged. Pirbright did not force the door that afternoon. He did, however, begin to open people, which was a subtler business, and one that left fewer marks. He started with Mrs. Giddings because she had started everything else. They sat in her front parlour, where the air smelled faintly of boiled water and almost used polish. She had chosen her best chair for him and her most truthful expression for herself. "Now, Mrs. Giddings," he said, folding his hands with the peaceful patience of a man preparing to listen to a sermon he had heard before, "you were the first to try the handle." "I was only returning the casserole dish," she said. "I'd never have gone otherwise. I'm not the sort." "Of course not." "I knocked twice, as anyone decent would." "And when there was no answer?" "I was sensible." "In what way?" "I tried the handle," she said, almost defensively. "It would have been rude not to." Pirbright considered the casserole dish still sitting on the sideboard like a relic from some smaller, earlier drama. "Had you any reason to think Miss Harker might be unwell?" Mrs. Giddings hesitated. It was no more than a flicker, but it passed through her face like a shadow on lace. "She coughed sometimes," she said, "but nothing you'd call improper." "And no visitors?" he asked gently. "She didn't entertain," Mrs. Giddings said, and then quietly, "Not that I saw." Pirbright let the word saw rest where it fell. He moved next to Mr. Dallin, among the quiet discipline of nails and wire, and the faint metallic reassurance of tools that did what they were told. "You tried the handle with a good deal of confidence," Pirbright observed mildly. "Had to," Dallin said. "If a door thinks it can stand up to you, it starts thinking all sorts of things." "Had you noticed anyone calling at Miss Harker's recently?" Dallin scratched his chin in the thoughtful way of a man who was not accustomed to being asked questions about other people's habits. "There was someone, maybe a week back, youngish man, didn't knock like he belonged. Hesitant, soft." "Could you see his face?" "No," Dallin said. "Could hear his shoes, though, light soles, not the workman sort." Pirbright thanked him and went on. Mrs. Pike was waiting for him before he reached her door. She had the air of someone who had been thinking for some time and had enjoyed it. "I told them," she said at once. "I told them she was too quiet, too careful. Those are the ones who attract trouble." "Trouble of what kind, Mrs. Pike?" "Men," she said, with an expression of personal sacrifice. "Men with bad intentions or worse, nice ones." Pirbright nodded as if she had given him a useful category of evidence. "And did you see anyone?" "I heard footsteps once, late-like, but they went away. She never opened the door after dark, not for anyone." Outside, the street had begun to acquire the curious air of a stage set before a performance. Curtains twitched, doors were left slightly ajar. People found excuses to pass Pennywell Row with emptier baskets than strictly necessary. Pirbright stood again before the locked door. Sergeant Reville hovered behind him, holding a notebook he had not yet found the courage to use. "No broken glass," Reville offered. "No signs of struggle," Pirbright replied without turning. A thin voice floated from a nearby window. "I saw her that morning. It belonged to Miss Talbot, who lived opposite, and had made a career of being unnoticed." "She was at the window," Miss Talbot said. "Not standing, sitting down like." "Was she alone?" Pirbright asked. Miss Talbot frowned, selecting carefully from among thoughts that had waited a long time to be invited out. "Well, there was shadow. Could have been the curtain. Or something else." "Or something else," Miss Talbot agreed with quiet pleasure. Pirbright thanked her, which surprised her deeply, and moved on. By early evening, the answers had begun to curve. Nobody had heard a cry. Nobody had seen a stranger clearly. Nobody had reason to believe anything terrible, and yet nobody felt comfortable believing nothing. Pirbright paused at the corner of the row, letting his eyes drift back towards the little house. 2 teacups, 1 chair drawn out, a locked door, a town learning how to tremble without admitting it. He made no notes, he asked no more questions. Instead, he walked slowly back towards the station, carrying with him a small collection of crooked answers that did not yet meet, but were beginning to recognize one another. Behind him, Flaxborough leaned closer to its own front windows. Inside the locked house, the air remained still, as though it too were waiting to be asked the right question. By the next morning, Flaxborough had found its shape again. It had not found its answers, but it had found something far more comforting: a direction. The locked door was still locked. The half-cup of tea had sunk to a deeper, more shamefaced brown. The milk bottle had been removed, not for evidence, but because it was beginning to look indecent. All that remained was uncertainty, and uncertainty, the town agreed, was no way to go on. So it chose a villain. His name was Arthur Bell. Arthur Bell lived at the far end of Orchard Lane in a house that had once been respectable and now looked merely tired. He had worked at the goods yard until he had not worked anywhere at all. He had a habit of standing too close when he spoke, and an unfortunate tendency to smile at times that did not invite smiles. "Never liked him," Mrs. Pike said calmly, as if she were announcing a preference for weak tea. "Always looking sideways at people." "He's been seen about the terrace," someone added. This was not strictly true, but accuracy was never the main interest. By 10:30, Sergeant Revel had been provided with 3 separate reports of Arthur Bell lurking. "Can't go acting on talk," Revel said, but he had already begun to picture Arthur Bell's face fitting neatly into the puzzle. Pirbright, listening, made no comment. He asked, instead, to see Arthur Bell. They found him behind his house, mending a length of wire with the intense attention of a man who considered himself invisible. He looked up slowly when he saw them. "Morning," Arthur Bell said. "Didn't expect visitors." "You have," Pirbright replied. Arthur smiled, briefly and badly. "Seems I often do lately." He wiped his hands on a cloth that had once been cleaner. "Anyone missing?" he asked, too casually. "Not officially," Pirbright said. "Had you been near Pennywell Row yesterday?" Arthur hesitated, not dramatically, just long enough to express private discomfort about the question. "I walked past. Everyone walks past. It's a street." "Did you stop?" Arthur's fingers tightened in the cloth. "I might have slowed. You can't call that stopping, though." Reveal shifted his weight, relieved. "You see," he murmured. "We've got him." Pirbright raised a hand, mildly, as if calming a horse. "Why slow down, Mr. Bell?" "I thought I saw movement," Arthur said. "That's all." Curtain twitched. Thought maybe she'd fallen. Or maybe she was watching. "And you didn't knock?" Arthur barked a small laugh. Miss Harker would have died of shock before she got to the door. Pirbright considered him silently. Arthur Bell was not clever. He was not particularly kind. He was, however, human. And human beings were rarely as neat as convenient theories. Back in town, the idea of Arthur Bell had begun to settle pleasingly. It gave shape to fear. It allowed conversations to end in agreement. "I always said he had the look." "You can tell by the hands." "Lives alone, always a sign." Pirbright returned to the station where Reveal was already drawing up a report that looked pleasingly conclusive. "Door locked," Reveal said. "Man with dubious habits. Presence in the area." "Indeed," Pirbright said. "And no alibi as such." "No." Reveal leaned back. "That should satisfy them." "That whom?" Pirbright asked mildly. "The town." Pirbright poured himself a cup of tea and did not drink it. He walked back towards Pennywell Row, alone, and let himself be absorbed into the slow rhythm of the street. People were watching him now, watching what he did with his hands, how long he stood still, Whether he frowned, he did none of those things. Instead, he stood before the door again, locked. He bent slightly, examining the line of varnish where the door met the frame. It was intact, no scratches, no fresh marks, no violence. He lifted the letterbox once more. Inside, the tray had been moved, by no more than an inch, but it had been moved. Or perhaps he had simply not noticed. He straightened. A child's voice floated down the street behind him. "Mum says they've caught the bad man." "That's nice," came the reply. Pirbright smiled, faintly, at nothing. Arthur Bell was a good villain. He fit well. The town could rest against him comfortably. If the door were broken, if the house were disturbed, if Miss Harker were found in some undignified position, Arthur Bell would absorb the blame like a sponge. It was neat. And therefore, he thought, possibly wrong. He walked back towards the station as afternoon settled into its usual resigned posture. Behind him, Pennywell Row breathed quietly. The locked door held its silence. Inside, the half-cup of cold tea waited patiently, while the tray sat just slightly askew, as if someone had nudged it long after the town had begun to tell itself it understood everything. By the third day, the town had grown used to the locked door in much the same way it grew used to a cracked paving stone, with careful steps and frequent glances. Pirbright had asked for the key. It was produced in a small, apologetic cloth by a distant cousin no one had seen in several years. The lock, when finally turned, opened without drama, which somehow disappointed those watching. The door opened inward. The air inside was older than the afternoon. It had the quiet, disciplined smell of boiled cabbage, furniture polish, and a life laid out in straight lines. Pirbright stepped in alone. He did not look first for the missing woman. He looked for the cup. The tray sat on the small hallway table, as it had before, but its position now seemed undeniable. It was not quite square with the edge. It was not quite careless enough to be accidental. 2 cups, one empty, one with a skin of long cold tea that had set into a thin, embarrassed film. He leaned closer, as if the china might speak if properly encouraged. Only one saucer bore a faint lip mark. The empty cup had been used, the full cup had not. This interested him more than it should have, which was usually a reliable indication that it interested him just enough. He moved further into the house. The sitting room was untouched in the particular way that suggested it had been left in a hurry, but by someone who disliked admitting it. Cushions arranged, rug straightened, fire laid but unlit. There was no sign of struggle because there had been no struggle worth recording. The bedroom offered the same quiet resistance. Bed made, slippers placed neatly side by side, a hairbrush on the dressing table, turned handle inwards as if it had been set down rather than dropped. Miss Harker was not in the house. This, too, was not as startling as it would have been elsewhere. In Flaxborough, absence could be arranged. The kitchen was last. Here the order loosened slightly. A plate, half-washed, stood in the rack. A tea towel hung unevenly as though someone had paused in the act of straightening it. The kettle was cold. On the table lay a folded paper. Not a letter, not a note. Just a piece of paper carefully folded into quarters and left, as if thoughtfully. Pirbright did not unfold it at once. He went back to the sitting room and sat down in Miss Harker's chair. This was not disrespectful. It was necessary. He needed to see what she might have seen. The angle of the door, the small table, the tray. From that position, he could see the teacups perfectly. A sense of mild impropriety settled over him, which he believed was probably accurate, though not in the way Flaxborough would have chosen. He picked up the folded paper and opened it. It was blank. He looked again, completely blank, no imprint, no impression. Someone had taken care to fold a sheet of unused paper and place it where it would be found. He folded it again, with equal care, and set it back where he had found it. Outside, footsteps gathered and dispersed. The town had assembled itself in small knots, each knot pretending to be accidental. Mrs. Giddings was just beyond the doorstep, whispering to Mrs. Pike. "You can tell by the way they've gone quiet when the policeman went in." "He's inside long time." "That's how you know it's serious." Pirbright passed them without comment. On the street, he was stopped by Mr. Harland, the postman, who carried not only letters but a quiet inventory of people's habits. "Morning, sir." "Morning." "She always took her post the moment I left it," Harland said. "Never let it sit." "You delivered on the morning she disappeared?" "Same as any other." "No interruptions?" Pirbright asked. Harland hesitated. There was a man at the corner of the street. Didn't speak, just stood and watched. "Which corner?" "The far one, by the grocer's." "Arthur Bell?" Pirbright asked without emphasis. "No," Harland said. "Too broad. This was a slimmer man, decent coat, gloves." "Middle-aged?" "Probably." Pirbright thanked him and walked. Back inside the station, the folded paper remained in his pocket. Reville was waiting for him. "Well?" Reville asked. "Nothing violent," Pirbright said. "Nothing disordered." "And the woman?" "Not there." Reville leaned forward. "That means Bell." "That means nothing yet," Pirbright said gently. That evening, Pirbright returned again to the house, alone. He did not turn on lights. He stood in the half-light and let the shape of the room settle again. He touched the rim of the full teacup. It left a faint mark, like skin remembering itself. Only one cup had been drunk from, only one chair had been moved, but 2 cups had been set out. Whoever had poured the tea had expected someone, or feared them enough to prepare. He looked at the blank folded paper again. Not a message, not a threat. A signal, perhaps. Something that said, "I thought ahead." He replaced it precisely. Outside, Flaxborough slept badly without admitting it. Curtains moved, breaths were held and released. Somewhere Miss Lavinia Harker was not sitting in her chair. The door remained unforced, the house remained tidy. And the cup of tea, still untouched, had waited long enough to become something more than a drink. It had become a promise that something in Flaxborough had been arranged rather than interrupted. The morning after the blank paper was discovered, Flaxborough expressed its unease by polishing itself. Lawns were cut that did not require cutting. Front steps were swept that had not held dirt. Smiles appeared where faces had previously managed without. It was the town's way of coping. If something felt wrong inside, one corrected what could be seen. Pirbright observed this from the far end of Pennywell Row, where the hedges leaned slightly towards one another, as if sharing a private joke. He walked slowly because haste would have been indecent. At number 14, Mr. Collins was trimming the same patch of grass for the 3rd time, his shears slicing at nothing with admirable commitment. "Morning, Inspector," he said, not pausing the cutting. "Morning." "You've been busy over there," Collins added lightly, nodding in the direction of Miss Harker's house. "There have been moments," Pirbright agreed. "Sad business," Collins said, "to lose a woman like that." "To lose her how?" Pirbright asked. Collins's smile tightened briefly. "Well, you know, missing." "Yes," Pirbright said, "missing." He walked on. Behind lace curtains, faces moved toward windows and then retreated again, embarrassed to be caught at such honest curiosity. At the corner house, Mrs. Lorimer was arranging geraniums that had already been arranged twice. "I suppose you'll find out the truth of it," she said without turning. "I hope so." She seemed such a settled woman. She did. She never caused talk. That is often a form of talk in itself, Pirbright said mildly. Mrs. Lorimer's hands paused over a pot. I never meant anything wrong. I would not suppose you did. He left her, staring unnecessarily hard at a leaf that had offended no one. The tidiness of the street was thick with implication. Every straightened mat and clipped hedge seemed to say that disorder, once acknowledged, might spread. Behind a low fence, young Mr. Trask was scrubbing his already pale garden gate. "They say you've got the man," he said, without preamble. "They do. Him from Orchard Lane." "That is being said." Trask lowered his voice. "Always thought there was something wrong about him." "Was there?" Pirbright asked. "He walked by too often." "How often?" Pirbright asked. Trask frowned. "Often enough to notice." "And often enough to remember exactly afterward?" Trask looked uncertain. "I suppose I never counted." "I wouldn't advise it," Pirbright said. At the small green, two women sat with their knitting. "She must have run off," one said carefully. "Some people just can't stand the quiet forever." "She was too old for that," the other replied. "Never too old for foolishness." Pirbright passed without interrupting. He turned instead toward the far edge of the town, where the houses loosened their order and the lawns were less obedient. Here, small grievances grew more freely. Mr. Hanlow was among his cabbages, pulling weeds that had every right to live where they were. "You knew Miss Harker?" Pirbright said. "Knew of her," Hanlow corrected. "Didn't know her." "Did you ever speak?" "No." "Did you ever watch?" Hanlow hesitated. "You notice things," he said, "when they stay the same too long." "What did you notice?" "A man, a few weeks back, at the edge of my gate, watching Pennywell Row." "You didn't say anything?" "Didn't feel like my business." "What sort of man?" "Sort of neat, gloves, didn't smoke, shoes were polished." Pirbright thanked him and moved on. By midday, Flaxborough had perfected its expressions. People smiled with a little too much symmetry. Nods were exchanged that meant nothing but said everything. Inside the post office, Mrs. Dale was lining stamps as though aligning the conscience of England. "You've upset people," she said. "I have upset very little," Pirbright replied. "They have upset themselves." "We don't like disturbance." "Nor do I." "Then why not finish it?" He smiled faintly. "Because it isn't finished." She sniffed, which was taken as resistance. On Pennywell Row the house remained quiet, the door still locked, the curtains still drawn, the inside still holding itself together with careful hands. Pirbright returned there and stood not before the door but beside the step. He crouched slightly to a posture more suggestive than suspicious. The grass at the edge of the step had been pressed down, not deeply, not violently, just enough to show that someone had stood there longer than politeness required, not forced, not fought, waited. He straightened slowly. Children passed, whispering, "That's him." "He's looking." Yes. He was. He looked at the varnish along the frame again. Perfect. He looked at the lace curtains, unshifted. He looked at the handle, patient. The street around him hummed with tidy fear, every smile a little thin, every lawn a little too even. Inside their houses people counted their teaspoons and folded their newspapers more precisely than usual. That afternoon, Sergeant Reville approached him. "We've got enough to bring Bell in proper," Reville said. "People want it done." "I understand what people want," Pirbright said. "They want it quiet again." "They will have it quiet," he said. Reville hesitated. "Don't you think it's him?" "I think," Pirbright said gently, "that towns like villains they can recognize." "That's not a crime." "No," Pirbright said, "but it's often a mistake." He stepped away from the door and let his fingers brush, almost absently, along the edge of the step once more, the slight flattening of grass, the weight that lingered, the waiting that had not been violent, not escape, not entry. A pause, a meeting point perhaps. Behind him, a curtain moved an inch and froze. Thin smiles held, lawns lay neat and blameless, and in the locked house the tea continued to darken quietly, as if even time itself was being kept in careful, respectable order. The second discomfort emerged late on a Thursday afternoon, when Flaxborough had begun to believe it had already endured its proper share of unsettlement. It began, as many things in town did, with something small and domestic, a boy, a parcel, and a gate left ajar. Young Edwin Marsh had been sent by his mother to deliver a paper-wrapped loaf to Mrs. Harrow on the edge of town, where the houses loosened their discipline and the hedges stopped pretending they were ornamental. He did not intend to discover anything. He only intended to throw the gate open, walk up the path, and be gone before Mrs. Harrow asked him questions. But the gate was already open. That was the first discomfort. The second was the sound, not a cry, not a crash, something lower and more peculiar, a dragging sound, patient, measured. Edwin, who was not built for heroism, remained where he was and did not announce himself. The sound stopped. He moved his eyes rather than his feet, which was prudent. Through the thin space between the garden shed and the hedge, he saw a shape that was not right for that setting. A small suitcase, not new, not battered, just an ordinary case with scuffed corners and a handle that had known too many hands. It sat on the path as if it had been set down there to think. Edwin did not approach it. He stepped backward and ran home, delivering neither loaf nor courage. By early evening, Mrs. Harrow had found it. She had opened the gate, seen the case, and stood very still. It was the correct response in Flaxborough. She did not touch it, she did not scream, she sent for revel. Sergeant Reville arrived in the sort of mood reserved for tea gone cold and boots gone missing. "What is it?" he asked. "A thing," Mrs. Harrow said. "That's clear." He approached it, slowly. It was locked. He knelt and examined the brass fixtures with an interest usually reserved for church silver. There was a faint mark on the case, not a scrape, not a cut, a smear. Reville straightened. "Male Pirbright," he said. The boy was found eventually and gave his account with many unnecessary gestures and the dramatic confidence of one who had not actually done anything. "Dragging," Edwin said, like someone didn't want it to go. Reville brought the case to the station. By 6:30, Pirbright stood before it. He did not touch it. He did not open it. He looked at it. "It's not quite new," Reville said. "No." "And not quite old?" "No." "And nobody's name on it?" "No. Shall we?" "Not yet." Reville frowned, but did as told. Outside, Flaxborough's tremor returned, small and persistent. People had already begun to hear. They found something by Harrow's. A case. Probably hers. Nobody's seen her, still. At 7, Pirbright went back to Pennywell Row. The door was locked again, as it always was. He did not use the key. He stood on the step. The grass at the edge was pressed down anew, fresher. He touched it lightly with a finger. Someone had been there since he last looked. The thought was not alarming. It was confirming. Inside, the air smelled faintly of tea gone too far. He unlocked the door. The tray had been moved again. Not much. Enough. The folded blank paper was now unfolded, not flat, creased, handled. Someone had been in the house, not searching, not breaking, visiting. Pirbright moved through the rooms, slow and soundless. In the bedroom, the wardrobe stood slightly ajar. Inside, one coat was missing. At the foot of the bed lay a handful of soil, not dropped, placed. He crouched. The soil was not local. It was lighter, sandy. He returned to the station just after 2000 hours. Revel was waiting. "We should open it," he said. Pirbright considered the case, then nodded once. Revel forced the clasp with reluctance. It opened with a small, almost polite noise. Inside was a blanket, folded. Under it a set of clothing, neatly arranged, woman's blouse, a skirt, shoes, and at the bottom, wrapped in paper, a small parcel. Revel waited. Pirbright unwrapped it. Inside was a strand of pearls, not expensive, not cheap, consistent. "This isn't her," Revel said. "No, there's no blood. No, there's no anything. No." Revel looked baffled. "What is it then?" Pirbright refolded the blanket. "Something meant to be found." "And the woman?" "I believe," Pirbright said quietly, "that she has not gone unwillingly." Outside, darkness collected itself along the hedges and fences. Inside the station, the case sat obediently open. No violence, no struggle, no simplicity. At 8:30, Mrs. Giddings heard about the suitcase and told Mrs. Pike that it was all becoming very much. Mrs. Pike agreed. By 9, Arthur Bell was being looked at again with renewed comfort. "Must have hid her things," someone said. "He'd do that sort." Pirbright did not correct them. Instead, he returned alone to Pennywell Row one more time. The house held its breath. He stood in the hallway. The blank paper lay open. The teacups were untouched. He looked at the doorframe. Just inside, low down, was a smudge, not footprint, not mud, a faint brush, as if a case had been dragged across the floor there before being lifted away. Someone had brought the suitcase from this house, not to it. He closed the door without locking it. That, too, was deliberate. On Orchard Lane, Arthur Bell sat alone, not knowing whether to feel relieved or frightened by his sudden importance. Flaxborough settled uneasily into darkness, holding close its tidy lawns and thin smiles. And somewhere, beyond the neat line of houses and clipped hedges, Miss Lavinia Harker continued not to be where she was expected. The first disturbance had been a locked door, the second was a suitcase. The third, Pirbright thought quietly, would not be so patient, and it would not wait so politely to be found. Pirbright chose not to go home. This was not unusual, though it was never spoken of. His rooms above the station were respectable, orderly, and blandly comforting. They offered tea that tasted of paper, and chairs that sighed faintly when used. They also offered answers too quickly, which was a habit he distrusted. Instead, he walked. Flaxborough at night was a quieter version of itself, but no less busy. Sounds moved behind curtains, nails tapped against glass, footsteps paused on pavements and then continued as though persuaded. He walked past Pennywell Row without stopping. This, too, was deliberate. The locked door had become too familiar. The house had begun to behave as if it expected him. He did not like that sort of relationship. He turned instead toward the canal. The water lay black and patient, reflecting the minimal ambitions of distant lights. The path beside it had been trodden into a kind of resigned obedience by those who walked it, to think or to avoid thinking. Pirbright joined them. He thought about the suitcase. It had not been abandoned, it had been placed. The difference was important. Abandonment was careless, placement was polite, even considerate. He thought about the folded paper, blank but deliberate. A thing done for a reason, too careful to be a mistake. And he thought of the teacups, one drunk from, one waiting. That was the point that returned to him now as the canal water shifted slightly against its weedy edges. 2 cups meant expectation, but only 1 chair drawn out meant control. If there had been a struggle, there would have been movement. If there had been fright, there would have been disorder. Instead, the room had held itself still, like a person deliberately keeping calm. He stopped and leaned lightly on the railing. Behind him, a man coughed and pretended not to exist further into the fog. Ahead of him, the black water accepted nothing and offered less. He thought of Miss Harker as a person, which was something the town had not yet attempted. She had been dependable, quiet, present in the way furniture is present. That did not mean she had been empty. It meant she had been observant. Observant people often saw too much and spoke too little. He resumed walking. At a bend in the path he found a bench that had been positioned not for comfort, but for propriety. He sat because it seemed to be expecting him. The wind moved faintly through the trees, disturbing very little and improving nothing. He pictured Arthur Bell trying to smile at the right moments and failing most of the time. Bell did not organize blank paper. He did not set out 2 cups and drink only 1. He did not drag suitcases carefully. Bell was a blunt thing in a town of folded manners. Bell was convenient. He was, therefore, wrong. Pirbright considered Mrs. Giddings, the way she had hesitated when asked about Miss Harker's health. The flicker, so slight, so easy to dismiss. He thought of the postman's man in gloves, of the flattened grass, of the smudge inside the doorframe. Someone had entered long enough to place things and leave. Someone had known the house. Someone had known the time. Someone had known Miss Harker well enough not to alarm her. He closed his eyes briefly. Not asleep. Just away from the world long enough to arrange it. The blank paper was not a message. It was a pause. It said, "I can make a decision in calmness." The pearls in the case were not hers. They were too modest, too chosen. They were bait, to suggest theft, to suggest motive, to point toward movement that had not happened. He opened his eyes. Across the water, a distant light blinked and steadied, like a thought that refused to settle. He stood and began to walk back toward the town, not fast, not slow, correctly. At the edge of the high street, he stopped at a window and looked in without being seen. A small gathering drank late tea, heads bent close, words flew in straight lines between mouths. She must be dead. They've found her things. He's dangerous. Comfort bloomed. It was not attractive. He moved on. At the station, he did not turn on the overhead light. He sat at his desk with only the small desk lamp burning, as if it were a private conversation rather than an illumination. The suitcase stood in a corner, closed now, more dignified. He opened it. The contents made no sound. Clothing, blankets, pearls. He lifted the blouse. There was a faint crease where someone had folded it with care, and then unfolded it once, perhaps to check that the line was correct. This was not the hand of panic. This was not the hand of crime. This was the hand of preparation. He put everything back, not because it was evidence, but because it was civil. He sat for a while longer, hands folded, eyes resting on nothing in particular. He thought of Flaxborough, not as a place, but as a habit of hiding small failures under neat surfaces, a habit of believing that because things looked orderly, they were, a habit of selecting villains who did not belong. He thought of Miss Harker standing at her small table, pouring 2 cups of tea, one for herself, one for someone she did not entirely trust. A meeting, perhaps, not forced, not rushed, arranged. He stood. It was late. The town outside had folded itself back into sleep, believing it had done well enough for one day. Pirbright turned off the lamp and went upstairs, not to bed, but to the small, square window above his room. From there he could see the dark shapes of hedges, the faint discipline of lamplight, the suggestion of houses asleep. He did not feel lonely. He felt focused. The time for quiet thinking was nearly done. Soon a question would need to be asked, and asked politely enough to be answered. He closed the curtains. Somewhere, beyond the comforting geometry of Flaxborough, a woman who had poured 2 cups of tea was not where she was expected to be. And someone who had arranged a suitcase believed briefly that arrangement was as good as escape. Pirbright did not. He washed his cup, dried it carefully, and set it upside down on the saucer. Then he turned out the light. Morning returned to Flaxborough without enthusiasm. It brought a thin fog that clung to hedges and flattened itself obediently against windows. The town accepted it as part of the cost of living quietly. Pirbright walked deliberately. Coat buttoned, hat settled with particular precision. The day was not to be hurried. It was to be arranged. He began at the grocer's. Mr. Elwick stood behind his counter as if nailed there by habit rather than duty, arranging apples in rows that implied fairness. "Morning, Inspector." "Morning." "You're still on that business?" Elwick said, lowering his voice unnecessarily. "The business?" "I am still in the town," Pirbright replied. Elwick smiled uncertainly. "You were here that morning?" Pirbright said without accusation. "I'm here most mornings." "I mean the morning Miss Harker stopped being ordinary." Elwick's fingers stilled. "I saw her," he said. "That has been said." "She came in early, bought nothing." "That is unusual." "Extremely. She looked as if she were measuring something." "In what way?" Elwick searched for the right kind of honesty. "Not prices, distances." Pirbright nodded. "And did you see anyone else?" Elwick hesitated. "There was a man waiting outside." "The man with the gloves?" "Yes." "Did they speak?" "Not that I saw." "But—" "Elbow moved," Elwick said, like he was guiding her, lightly. "Acquaintance, not force. Politeness, not threat." Pirbright walked on. He called at Mrs. Dale's post office. She was already waiting for him. "You've unsettled things," she said. "That is not my intention." "You are asking questions differently." "I hope so. You don't want the loud answers." "I don't." She studied him. "You think someone we like has done something we don't like?" "I think," he said gently, "that someone respectable has done something careful." Her lips thinned. "I never trusted quiet women." "I've met loud ones I liked less," he replied. She almost smiled. He went next to the church, where Mr. Hainsworth, the churchwarden, was polishing brass that did not require it. "You unlocked the vestry last Tuesday?" Pirbright said. "Yes." "At what time?" "Midday." "Did anyone come in unnoticed?" "People are always unnoticed in churches." "That was not my question." Hainsworth looked at the brass more carefully. "A woman came in?" he said. "Miss Harker?" "Yes." "And?" "She sat." "Alone?" "No?" "That's helpful," Pirbright said mildly. Hainsworth stiffened. "A man sat behind her." "The man with the gloves?" "I didn't see his hands." "But—" He did not sing. This, in Flaxborough, was almost criminal. Pirbright left the church. The fog had lifted enough for shapes to be trusted again. He walked to Orchard Lane. Arthur Bell was at his fence, arguing silently with a gate that did not respect him. "Morning," Bell said, badly. "Morning." "You still looking at me?" "I am looking everywhere." "That suitcase?" "That suitcase was moved from inside Miss Harker's house," Pirbright said. Bell blinked. "I've never been in her house." "I believe you." Bell looked so surprised that it would have been rude to doubt him. Pirbright leaned slightly closer. "Has anyone asked you to stand somewhere for them recently?" Bell's mouth opened, then closed. I was asked to pass Pennywell Row." "Asked by whom?" Bell shifted. "He said it'd make me look important." "Who?" Bell stared at the gate. "I don't know his name. What did he look like?" "Gloves," Bell said miserably. "Decent coat. Shoes too good for the lane." "Did he mention Miss Harker?" "No." "Did he mention me?" A pause. "Yes." Pirbright straightened. "What did he say?" Bell swallowed. "He said the inspector would believe me more if I looked guilty." At midday, Pirbright returned to the station. Sergeant Reevil watched him carefully. "You're quiet," Reevil said. "I am preparing." "For what?" "For a conversation." "Who with?" Pirbright folded his hands. "Mrs. Giddings." Reevil almost choked. "That casserole woman?" "That very one." "That's mad." "That's tidy," Pirbright said. He walked back to Pennywell Row. Mrs. Giddings had already reopened her curtains to exactly the correct width for listening. He knocked. She opened the door quickly, as if she had been standing behind it. "Inspector." "May I come in?" "Of course." Her parlour had been improved, cushions smoothed, ornaments realigned. "Mrs. Giddings," he said, sitting where she told him to sit, "you said Miss Harker never entertained." "She didn't." "You said she had no visitors." "She didn't." "You said she coughed sometimes." "She did." "You hesitated." She folded her hands. "That's unkind." "Did Miss Harker trust you?" "She borrowed sugar." "That is not trust." "She borrowed stamps." "That is not trust." "You are preparing?" she said suddenly. "Yes," he replied. "For what?" "For the truth." Her lips tightened. He leaned slightly forward. "Did you ever go into her house when she was not there?" Silence. "Not recently," she said. "That was not my question." She stood. "I don't like this." "That is natural." He rose as well. "I will ask one last thing, Mrs. Giddings." "What?" "Did you help her leave?" She breathed in sharply. The room felt smaller. Outside, a footpath crunched. Inside, the clock ticked. She looked at him, and she did not answer. The parlour of the Women's Guild had never witnessed any calamity larger than a scorched scone, and it was with a faint sense of outrage that it hosted something bordering on truth. The long table was arranged with modest ceremony, folded napkins, biscuits laid out with that faint air of duty that belonged exclusively to public refreshments. The brass clock on the wall ticked as if mildly offended by company. They had come because they had been asked. In Flaxborough, that was reason enough. Mrs. Giddings sat nearest the door, upright and composed, as if good posture might protect her. Mrs. Pike whispered once and then decided against it. Mr. Dallin had been permitted to attend on the grounds that he was useful in emergencies, though no one expected an emergency that required a man with iron filings on his cuffs. Arthur Bell was not present. That, too, was deliberate. Inspector Pirbright stood by the window not as a figure of authority but as a piece of well-placed furniture. "I shan't take much of your time," he said mildly. "Flaxborough values its routines." There was a small sound of approval. "I should like," he continued, "to explain what has already happened." Silence became a respectable guest. "Miss Lavinia Harker was not taken," Pirbright said. "She was not dragged. She was not frightened in her chair." Several people looked faintly disappointed. "She left." Mrs. Pike shifted. "Left where?" "She left with assistance," Pirbright said, "without noise, without disorder, and without informing those who would have stopped her." He turned, slowly, and let his eyes rest on Mrs. Giddings. "You were kind to her," he said gently. "I was decent," she replied. "You were more than that." Her hands tightened. "Miss Harker discovered some weeks ago," Pirbright went on, "that someone had been making use of her circumstances." Mr. Dallin cleared his throat. "How?" "It began with small things," Pirbright said. "A loan asked and not recorded, a favour suggested and accepted, then letters, then papers. Faces shifted. "There was a man," he said. "Neat. Gloves. Polished shoes." He approached Miss Harker with quiet sympathy. He spoke of investments, of security, of protection. Mrs. Dale, who had been invited at short notice, nodded almost without meaning to. "She signed something," Pirbright said. Mrs. Giddings's eyes flickered. She did not know at first that she had signed away what little independence she possessed, Pirbright said. By the time she did know, she was ashamed. The room breathed carefully. "She came to you," he said, still without direct accusation. Mrs. Giddings's lips tightened. "She told you," he said softly. "No," Mrs. Giddings said. "She didn't tell everything." "She told enough," Pirbright said. He moved away from the window and closer to the table. "You helped her leave," he said, not unkindly. Mrs. Giddings looked down at her hands. "I didn't want her becoming a laughing matter," she said finally. "People here enjoy that sort of thing too well." "That was kind," Pirbright said. "It was not lawful," Mrs. Pike said sharply. "No," Pirbright agreed. "The suitcase," Mr. Dallin said. "Was staged," Pirbright said. "Not by either of you." He let that settle. "The man in the gloves found her."
"Absence troublesome," he continued. "He needed her to be thought taken, or harmed, or stupid. He needed attention elsewhere." Mrs. Giddings whispered, "I told her not to trust him." "She trusted necessity," Pirbright said, "which is not the same thing." He folded his hands. "You arranged a meeting," he said to Mrs. Giddings. "2 cups of tea, one for her, one to show you were not afraid." Mrs. Giddings gave a small, dry laugh. "I was terrified." "You drank your cup." "She did not," Pirbright said. "She was too busy finishing a letter, one you later destroyed." "I burned it," she said. "I burned it in my kitchen stove." "You should not have," Mrs. Pike murmured. "No," Pirbright said. "But I understand." He turned to the rest of them. "She is not dead," he said. "She is staying with relatives in a village that does not ask questions and does not expect her to be decorative." There was an audible loosening. "The man with the gloves has already left town," Pirbright went on. "He does not like places where people are alert." "And Arthur Bell?" someone asked. "He was asked to be seen," Pirbright said calmly. "And he was foolish enough to comply." There was a collective exhale. Mrs. Giddings looked up at him. "You're not taking me away," she said. "No," Pirbright said. "Why?" "Because Miss Harker is safe," he replied. "And because Flaxborough would punish you more painfully than I ever could." A faint ripple of uncomfortable humour passed the table. Silence fell again, but it was a different kind. It was the kind that comes after understanding. The clock ticked. Outside, a cart rattled on. Tea sat untouched in cups that no longer looked dangerous. When it was finished, they did not stand at once. They remained sitting, carefully holding their accepted lives. Pirbright put on his hat. At the door, Mrs. Giddings stopped him. "She'll be all right?" she asked. "She always was," he said gently. He stepped into the street. The sky had the tired look of a day that had carried something heavy and laid it down quietly. Behind him, the town went on. Ahead of him, the hour moved into its usual order. And though the truth had been spoken without drama, Flaxborough felt it settle in the small, careful spaces where secrets preferred to live. It was calm. It was civil. And for the first time since the door had been found locked, it was no longer pretending. The morning after truth, Flaxborough behaved as if nothing had happened, which was the highest compliment it could offer itself. Curtains were drawn back to their usual modest widths. Steps were swept with renewed moral purpose. Milk bottles were collected before anyone had time to notice how long they had stood waiting. Miss Harker's door was unlocked. This single, quiet change was never discussed. It was simply understood in the way that only small towns understand anything, collectively and
without witnesses. Mrs. Giddings walked past the house twice and did not stop. Mrs. Pike paused once, thought better of looking, and moved on with a tight expression that suggested she disapproved of lateness, dust, and human weakness in roughly equal proportions. Inside the house, no one touched anything. The table remained where it had been. The tray stayed in its careful, slightly wrong angle. 2 cups sat as they had sat for days beyond counting, one stained, one patient. The post lay on the mat and was not gathered. It was better that way. At the station, Sergeant Reville completed his paperwork with exaggerated precision. He sharpened a pencil that did not need sharpening and aligned a stack of forms that had never rebelled. Pirbright watched without comment. "You're going to write it up?" Reville asked. "In time." "You won't mention her neighbour?" "No." "You won't mention any of it, will you?" "I will mention that a woman went away because she was entitled to," Pirbright said. Reville sat back in the relief of that. At midday, Pirbright walked the streets without purpose, which for him was a kind of purpose. People nodded to him in a way that suggested gratitude without commitment. "A good man," someone whispered, carelessly. "He kept it decent," another said. He did not respond. At the grocer's, the apples had been rearranged so often that they looked newly confident. "You finished it?" Mr. Elwick asked. "I have stopped it," Pirbright replied. "That is not the same." Elwick accepted this because it sounded official. He passed the church. The brass was polished. The pews were empty. A quiet remained that had nothing to do with God. At the canal, the water moved without ambition, taking no interest in small human arrangements. He paused there and watched it accept reflections without judgment. Somewhere beyond the edge of fields and proper hedges, Miss Harker sat in a room that did not know her history. She poured a single cup of tea now, for herself. There was no second cup. There was no need. Back in town, Arthur Bell stood at his gate and waved at nobody. For the first time in several days, people did not look at him. This hurt him. This relieved him. Both feelings remained unfamiliar. That evening, Mrs. Giddings washed her cups a second time, though they were already clean. She did not think of herself as brave. She thought of herself as practical. She wondered briefly if Miss Harker had remembered to bring slippers. She hoped so. On Pennywell Row, the night fell with careful civility. One window remained dark that had always been faintly lit. No one mentioned this. They went to bed earlier. They spoke more softly. They folded their newspapers with slightly less confidence. In his room above the station, Pirbright filled out his final line with measured hand. No excess, no ornament, no unnecessary truth. He placed the completed report in the drawer that was not used often. Then he made himself tea. Just 1 cup. He held it for a moment before drinking, feeling the quiet weight of it in his hands. The town resumed its breathing. A dog barked once and was silenced by conscience. A clock struck 9 and felt proud. The house on Pennywell Row settled into the kind of emptiness that did not hurt, because it was no longer pretending. By morning, the tale would become something smaller. By next week, it would be something tidier. By next month, it would be something other people had got wrong. This was as it should be. Before sleeping, Pirbright stood at the small window and drew the curtain closed. The night outside remained orderly. The hedges held their lines. The roofs wore their darkness properly. In the silence that followed speaking, the town did not feel heroic. It felt unchanged, which was its favourite state. And in that quiet, carefully maintained world, Inspector Pirbright returned to his paperwork, his tea, and the unspoken knowledge that sometimes the kindest justice was the one no one could point at,